Hey everyone, welcome back to the Wealth Preservation Podcast. We are joined again by Caylan and Label Live. If you did not hear about his origin story, it is the episode right before this one, and it is fascinating. He took a very, I'd say, a long roundabout way to get to label making. It was not a direct family business he took over. So
yeah, I love that we talked about frozen banana stands. We got non-bread in there. We got organic farming,
living on a farm.
We got Linux talk in there. If you're a tech person, I mean, we kind of hit it. We talked to some child rearing philosophy. We it was a serendipitous route around, but it was
he
good.
Almost saved the insurance industry, and then he left it in a shamble, which makes my life harder.
We're still mad at him about that. We found out that's another reason we don't like him.
We agreed to episode 2.
He should have fixed the insurance industry and chose not to.
But anyway, all that to say, episode 1, very fascinating. We're very excited about episode 2. Caylan, thank you again for being on.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
Yes. Now, real quick, I don't know if you can do a 2 to 3 minute recap of episode 1, but can you give us just a snapshot of, again, your company, where you're at, and really the reason why you headed into, you spoke about that gap between tech and I forgot how you put it much more elegantly. I'm just going to butcher it if I try and repeat it, but really how you landed in this space.
Yeah, you bet. So for the last 9 years now, I've been a consultant. So what I tell people is I make hardware work with software. So I'm an integrator. I build apps and program software to basically allow people to control sensors or robots or label printers. And what has given me a unique advantage is that I have a background of communicating with customers and clients and customer service. And so, and I thank my parents for giving me kind of a left brain, right brain mix. I'm left-handed, but I'm creative and analytical. And so I'm able to develop the solution that the customer wants. I can listen to their specification, and then I can deliver something that is beautiful and works well. And so a lot of times when you look at like a triangle, and it's like you can have it fast, you can have it cheap, or you can have it work well, and you can pick 2, right?
2 and 3.
And for me, I've done really well by being fast and works well and expensive. And so from a consulting perspective, I lose out on bids for from companies who want to save a buck.
Yeah.
But for companies that have a crucial product that they need developed for a specific niche, and it's on a really tight deadline, and they need someone to really take ownership of the project, that's where I've excelled as a consultant in the tech space. Now, most of my work has revolved around like Internet of Things, IoT, specifically the industrial Internet of Things. So that's the IIoT. This is like Bluetooth sensors. It is collecting factory measurements and data and sending it to the cloud. That is kind of the software that I develop as a consultant. And as we talked about before, about 5 years ago, I thought, oh, I've got a couple of really good clients, and if they fire me, I got to find a real job, and I am basically unemployable in my current mental state. Like, I'm not going to go into an office. I'm not going to work for a salary. I really like the flexibility. I like not feeling guilty, or that I don't feel like I'm being taken advantage of when I work until 3 in the morning. Like, it's a decision that I make to do for myself, and that's really important. But I also don't feel guilty when I'm not checking my email by 10 a.m. every day. So there's a certain flexibility that I've come to not really compromise with, in a sense. Like surely I am up at 5 a.m. answering emails, or I am going to bed early. But those are things that I get to decide on my own, which has kind of led me down this path. So 5 years ago, I look at my life and I'm like, okay, if my clients fire me, which they weren't in any position to do, I just have to say, like, things were stable and secure. I just thought, gosh, if something were to happen, what am I going to do? I'm working hourly. All the different all the different books about entrepreneurship, or if I talk to mentors, would say, if you want to grow, you need to do something that's more than your hourly rate. You can't be just charging X number of dollars per hour and expect to retire. And I'm not really particularly good at saving for retirement at this stage. I mean, I say that, but for what it's worth, it's just that's how my investments have been in business and in zero debt, you could say.
Mhm.
So this is a wealth podcast, right? So I'm like, why do they want to hear about this?
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
But at the same time, when what it came down to is I thought, I'm pretty good at taking hardware. That means like little computer bits that aren't really attached to a computer and making them work with an app that you like touch or click. And so I started thinking like, what are some of the most hated pieces of hardware on the planet that have the worst software? Where is this opportunity, this gap between um, things that exist that we think should work a certain way and then the reality of how they do work? And I had some experience with label printers, specifically like a Zebra printer. It was just it would print like, 2 inch by 1 inch labels, like shelf tags for a grocery store. And I thought, why can't I design and print these shelf tags on my Mac? Like, there's no software that I can just like plug the Zebra printer in and like drag a barcode and drag some text and integrate spreadsheet data. And then like if you're asked to do any kind of mail merge with like Microsoft Word and Excel, you just want to like jump out of the window. Like it's still terrible. You have to
I've
Google it.
almost
You don't
jumped
know
out of
what
multiple
version you're
windows
on.
trying to do that before, just with the mail merge
Yeah,
function.
it's so bad.
Like, why don't the
It's so
labels
bad.
fit when you print them on the size that it says on the Avery package? What? Anyway,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's still largely an unsolved problem. Which Label Live like attempts to solve. And my whole thing was, yeah, so we rewind. It's like 5 years ago. I'm like sitting on my couch with this label printer thinking, I kind of know how to write software for these. And truth be told, like 3 years prior, before I started consulting, I wrote a very quick Mac native app that was called Label Scope. And Label Scope, it was this like kind of a play. It's a unique app that doesn't. I published version 1.0 and I've never published an update. It sells like one copy a month at $15. So I've made like maybe 600 or 700 bucks on this app over the course of its lifetime, over 9 years. It's never been touched on the App Store. But what it does is it shows you this like little virtual label on your screen. And whenever you drag it around on the screen, and you can make it bigger, smaller, but whatever's behind it gets turned into black and white. And if you double click it, it sends that to the printer.
Oh,
And so it was this like weird kind of like VR, like with a fake label that you drag over. So if you like formatted some address label on your screen, you could just like drag this window over it and double click and it would print it out. So it did no more than that. And so I had like some idea of how to integrate label printers with the Mac, but I realized like the Mac is such a small piece of the puzzle, right? Like people want to print on their Windows machine and their Mac. So at the time, about 4 or 5 years ago, there was this new technology on the block called Electron. And Electron is the same technology that powers apps like Slack and Skype and VS Code and Discord and a ton of other apps.
Small players.
Hundred,
Yeah.
hundreds of apps. I mean, they're just like, they're all over the place. But the thing with Electron is it's inefficient for the user because every app that you have on your computer that's Electron based is not sharing the things that they could share. So they
yeah.
use a lot more memory and a lot more disk space than they should. So if you are a purist, computer nerd, you kind of by default hate Electron apps because they're just seen as like this lowest rung on the application developer tool chain or something like that. But for an independent software developer like me, it presented this really interesting way where I could develop an app and then publish it on both platforms and have it available to basically every computer user on the planet that's using a Mac or a Windows machine. So it was really valuable in that respect. And it's the same code largely between the two platforms. So I sat down, started like building this like really rudimentary thing. The tech stack of Label Live is an Electron app, but it's built using React, which is like a foundational web technology. So Label Live is a web app that's kind of sandwiched together in these layers that make it look like it's an application on your computer. It's not really talking to the internet for its user interface. You can use Label Live completely offline, but in a nutshell, it is a label that's on the screen. You can add text, images, shapes, barcodes. You can then import spreadsheet data and quickly integrate and print a batch of labels. And you can print to a label printer like a Zebra Thermal, or a render to a PDF that can be then sent to a printer like Avery Sheets.
Okay.
And so this, like, what it's solving is about 100 different use cases, all through the same kind of generic user interface, which is just a simple screen with 4 tabs in the corner to help you set up your label, design your label, integrate data, and then print the label. And that's all there is to it. And there's a deep technical discussion about like the inherent complexities of building something like this, all the way to the philosophical of like, um, what does it mean to make something simple? And so you go
Yeah.
ahead and lead the discussion of where you want to go with this, because I feel like
Well,
I'll
well,
get too
first of
deep in
all,
the weeds if we don't structure it.
yeah, well, just for our listeners, kind of like, what is kind of like the market segment that you built it for? Like, who's the big user of Live Label Live? Sorry.
Yeah, it is it's kind of an existential question. So there is not one industry that dominates my customers. I
Yeah.
can look back at the last 50 and they are all different. It could
Yeah.
be a coffee roaster wanting to print a roasted on date label. It could be a grocery store with shelf tags. It could be a nuclear isotope facility that's labeling isotopes in a warehouse. It could be COVID test results. It could be um, organizing yarn, at a quilt shop. It could be wrapping wire labels, labels that go around wires that are plugged into like AV equipment at
Okay.
large facilities that are doing like concerts. It could
Yeah.
be um, large automotive companies that rhyme with Blessia that are organizing warehouse parts.
Yeah.
There's a lot of use cases, and really what it amounts to is like, if you need to print something on a printer that has a limited resolution, like thermal printers, you need to make sure that you have software that knows exactly how to structure the dots that appear on the label so that they're
Sure.
not blurry, which blurry is not really something that exists on a label printer. It either works or it doesn't. So that's so
Yeah.
so label printing, like I consider these things like miniature printing presses,
Yeah.
and they have all these. Doug DeMiro, he's a YouTuber that does like car reviews, and he always says, "This is a label printer," and this I'm gonna walk around it and show you all of its quirks and features, and go into these details, and I think label printers have quirks and features that are incredibly annoying to everybody on the planet, and no one wants to deal with it. And
Yeah.
so they rely on software. And for a software developer to internalize those complex things and then present those choices to the user
Sure.
is a very heavy lift. And
Yeah.
that's why, in essence, all label printer software is garbage.
Yeah.
All label printer software is garbage. Love it. That's gonna get snipped, quoted. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So just,
I mean,
me not being knowing much about label printing, except I've tried to print Avery labels before and wanted to jump out the window, like you talked about. How are you like, okay, there's this niche that needs to be fixed, but how do I monetize it too, right? Because I mean, obviously, you want to get paid for the work you're doing. So how do you monetize that, and does it integrate with other tech stacks, or how does that work?
sure. So originally, when I created this app, I really focused on the Mac side.
Okay.
And my first publishing of it was to the Mac App Store. And it was what I would consider like an MVP, minimal viable product. It was
Sure.
a prototype. But as I worked on that prototype, it became really clear that in order for it to be useful, there was what I would call like table stakes. There were certain features that needed to exist to make the value proposition like worthwhile for a user.
Yeah.
That was being able to import images, layout text, print barcodes, and integrate spreadsheet data.
Okay.
Spreadsheet data was like the biggest thing, the biggest decision to add early on that really just, that's just what has to be there,
Yeah.
CSV or spreadsheet data. Once I had that built and I published to the Mac App Store, The next day, I checked my sales, and I had sold a copy to the Caribbean, right? The App Store doesn't tell you who buys it; they just give you like general geographies.
Yeah.
And I was like, huh, I don't think I told anyone in the Caribbean about this, but that's pretty interesting. And I was selling it for $15. And so I thought, okay, well, no advertising, just published it. Someone bought it. Immediately, I was like, that's really interesting. So I then made a website for it. I sold a couple licenses every day and started receiving customer emails. And at that point, it was like, can it do this? Can it do that? Can it work with this printer? And I have now serviced like 2,500 emails probably from customers that
Yeah.
have all, I would say 1 out of 10 emails starts out with, I love your software. Thank you so much. Right. The other 9 are like, how do I do this? 1 out of 100 is like, it's not working. Help,
Yeah.
or you've stolen my money, or something like that. And I'm like, hey, no, have a refund. It's no big deal. It's more important that you're happy than
Yeah.
your money. Like that's not an issue. So the rare customer kind of like, I actually tell them when people call and they're really upset, I tell them, I say, just so I'm here to help you. Um, but and usually I talk them off the ledge because a lot of times they'll call on like a Sunday, and I'm one of the rare developers that publishes like a 1-800 number, Google Voice number on the website that rings
Sure.
my cell phone
Yeah.
24/7. So
Yeah.
I get like maybe 4 or 5 phone calls a day, um, from all over the world. I'll wake up to missed calls from Paris, South Africa, Philippines, Singapore, like all over the world. And sometimes they'll leave a voicemail. Sometimes they'll like, my favorite customers email me twice and then call immediately. And I'm like, I'm answering your why are you calling? Like,
Yeah.
but anyways, I get calls on like Sundays and they'll say, um, I need to print 30,000 labels before Monday morning or else I'm fired. And I'm like, okay, well, this is like, we can do this,
Yeah. We can.
and here's how. The first time it happened, I was super stressed. The 10th time it happened, I'm like, this is just part of doing business, right? I mean,
Right.
people got
Yeah.
deadlines, and I don't get stressed out about it anymore.
Well, plus
Which I
practice
think we
empathy
cut.
because they've been working on that project probably since like last Wednesday, right? And trying to get, or since
Mhm.
Friday afternoon, and they're already you're like at the 11th hour, right? You're like you get to be the hero.
The problem for them is Label Live 2 years ago was on like the 5th page of search results, so they
Okay.
were like digging deep. They were
Yeah.
like, oh, I found it. Now it's on like the first page of search results for a lot of terms, which has helped considerably. People get the right solution in the hands.
Yeah.
A lot of times, just navigating um, these questions and needs, it becomes and there's like 10 ways to go with this conversation, but one is like a balancing act, right? You have to prioritize all these competing requests from customers.
Sure.
And from a consultant's perspective, I might be on a monthly retainer with a client, and there's a contractor part of it and a consulting part of it. The contractor is getting paid for work. The consulting is getting paid for advice,
Sure.
right? A lot of times the client will say like, we really want to do this, and I'll say, here's why it's a good idea, here's why it's a bad idea, you make the decision, but I recommend not doing that for these reasons. But with Label Live, I'm in much more control, and I have to then take the feature request and multiply it against what I think the future demand for that feature will be. And a lot
Right.
of times early on it was like, holy cow, if I add this feature, it's going to double my sales. Now it's more like, if I add this feature, it'll move the needle by like 2%. That's
Yeah.
kind of just how I think of it. And if I
Mhm.
can find easy things to change in the app that increase revenue by 2%, and I can find one of those a month, I mean, that's still, a
Yeah.
great revenue increase from year over year. That is in a very short summary of how I make those business decisions to add features to the app. Because a lot of people are like, I want rounded text that blinks, and I'm like, well, how are you going to make text blink on a label? It's like it doesn't
Right.
it doesn't make sense, like how they request things, and I have to kind of read between the lines of what they're trying to do.
Sure.
Yeah. Which it's got to be nice to be like, you receive all these requests and you're like, well, I'll have my engineering team look into that, right? And
Yeah.
I just pass the message along, and I let I let those suckers deal with that headache.
And if you read the website on the about page, it says like, if you call, you're probably going to talk to me. And
Hmm.
people do call, and they're like, "Wow, I really am talking to you." And they're like, "Is this a robot? Is this a recording?" And I'm like, "This is not a recording." And it's like it's hilarious. But I part of my fear is, hiring out that support component is losing that immediate touch point with the customer.
Sure.
And I saw this really uh, as a solo developer, you are very much like it's a deep relationship with your customer base, right?
Yeah,
And your customer becomes like this fictitious kind of thing. And I think there's I don't know the psychological name for it, but there's like a limit to how many personal connections the human brain can kind of hold on to at any given time. It's like 100 or 150. And with customers, if I'm dealing with like 10 or 15 touch points of a customer each day, and there's like a 2 week period where it's like I can't really remember, and I can remember like 90% of my customers out of like the 2,000 or 5,000 or however many it is that have contacted me. But it gets kind of spooky when you're like they've all blended into like an amorphous blob customer, and you're like trying to like look up their support ticket to be like, I wrote those words, but I don't,
remember?
that was like late at night or something like that.
Yeah,
It's very interesting. And I worry that hiring out for support staff um, will decrease the quality of just about every feedback loop that's been like so tight so far.
sure.
And so
Yeah,
that's definitely a consideration going forward
Yeah.
as I grow.
yeah,
So, and kind of going off a tangent into that side of the business, right? Because I think that's what we've had a couple other people on our podcast who are super happy to outsource, right? They're like, oh yeah, doing that outsource, awesome. But then there were sections where they're like, once I outsource that, I cut out a piece of me out of the business, right? We had some pepper flake roasters in Tennessee, right? And there are certain elements to their business where they're like, we outsourced a lot of things, but there are just some things where like as soon as we cut that out, it was almost like Old Verdens was just another pepper company, right? So have there been things that you have outsourced and been like, hey, that was great to get off my plate? If so, what were those? And then obviously you said the customer support is something that you're a little nervous to outsource.
Strategically, just looking at the burden of the business on like work life balance, right?
sure.
Like I am, if you would have asked me 3 years ago, my consulting business is the focus of my life, work life, and Label Live is a side hustle. It was making $500 a month, $1,000 a month at the start of the pandemic. Fast forward to March 2022, this is a record month that has surpassed it has reached a record month in 20 days out of the month.
Yeah,
So right now, for every day until the end of March, it is now just the chart just keeps growing off the charts, right? But I'm still able to take 2 or 3 hours to dedicate to providing like an interview and do
sure.
this because I think it's important because it helps me understand what the reality is. So now my consulting has become a side hustle.
Yeah,
Label Live is now very much eclipsing the consulting revenue, and I have to make a decision of how I move forward with those businesses
yeah,
because consulting provides me a very nice, stable income, um, and I get to use and recommend new technology. Label Live is something where I think to myself, if I would have quit consulting a year ago, could I have grown Label Live even more? And the
sure.
answer is absolutely yes. Yes, I could have. The risk structure of going down each of those routes isn't obvious because you're dealing with something that, with label printing, it's like my competitors in the space are making 20 million a year, 30 million a year. And I am not competing on those enterprise levels by any means, but I am satisfying the need for 90% of what people need to do.
Sure.
And if I can come in at a much lower price point, then I don't think I am I know that I am underestimating the size of the market
Yeah,
and the size of the need, and I don't really understand how much farther it can grow. I think I could probably 10x my revenue in the next 2 years. But what does that mean for that work-life balance? What does it mean for
Right.
consulting? What does it mean for like who I am?
Mhm.
I mean, those are all like deep questions that I don't think, like I'm deeply grateful to be in that position to try to decide what the best route is.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But like with raising children, you're kind of like, hey, let's see where it goes, and we'll try to like
Yeah.
keep
It's
you
like,
from falling in the pool or falling out of the boat kind of thing, and
right.
let it grow on its own. So I think what's really interesting about this market, just to like go back and talk about the existing label printer market. If you were a business that needed to print a couple hundred labels a day, and you needed to print on shelf tags, just little labels, and you wanted to put barcodes on them to put on your products or something like that, you would go to a website that sold label printers. Let's just take Zebra as an example. Zebra does not sell directly to the customer. They sell through a distributor network. All the software that they sell is through a distributor network. And so there isn't, you have to go in there and basically spend $1,000 to get a $500 printer and a $500 piece of software. And what I'm doing to that market is basically saying you can bring your own printer and the software costs you $150 one time. And that's been a very generous, depending on how you look at it. If you're just coming in and wanting to print QR codes for your scouting troop or whatever organization you have, $150 is a lot of money.
Sure.
But if you're looking at saving tens to hundreds of hours of process time in a business, $150 is nothing. I mean, it could be $150 a month and people wouldn't blink an eye at it. So how do I, you know, create a pricing structure that brings kind of everyone under the same tent to provide that service? And it's a challenge
Yeah.
to understand what is happening in that market to offer the best value. For
Yeah.
example, like distributors don't want to sell my software because it's too inexpensive. They would much rather sell a $400 piece of software and get a 30% cut than sell $150 and what's left over. So
Right.
it's an interesting challenge. Where that then gives me an advantage though is in Google Analytics. I can provide very specific conversion values to Google to say when someone searches for label printer software and they come to my site and pay $150, you now know to send more people that fit that AI model
Okay.
to my website, and then it boosts my ranking for those kinds of things. So
Oh, cool.
I'm
Yeah.
at an advantage in the sense that I'm like direct to consumer and direct to business in that way, that provides that analytical feedback to the Google algorithms, not necessarily to track users, but just to track what is valuable to people searching for different things on the website.
Right. Yeah. So I kind of want to go back to a little bit. Like, I love this question because there's always that part in every entrepreneur's journey of like, when did you know that this business? You're like, oh wow, this is actually a thing. Holy cow! Like, when that you sent out that first one, that person from the Caribbean clicked on it and bought it. You were like, wow, oh,
Could,
somebody
could,
actually wants to buy my stuff. What the
and
heck?
it could have been to a banana stand.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because Mark and I joke about that too. We always laugh that we publish this podcast and we look at our analytics and we're like, it still cracks us up that people listen to us. You know what I mean? It's usually because we have exciting guests. They actually don't want to listen to us; they want to listen to you. But it's just really funny that you're putting something out to the nether, right? It's out there, and you don't know who's consuming it and how it's affecting them. And some of the feedback you get, you're like, oh, good and bad. But when was that point where you're like, oh, this is a thing?
There have been like 20 or 30 of those moments where I've thought, and it's like with any, so my mom was very much like had a gambling, not problem, but like she gambled.
Yeah,
And I had grown up knowing that had like damaged things within the family at some level,
yeah.
whether or not, and and so now I can't gamble. Like I don't do any gambling, but I'm an entrepreneur, so it's like every day is like full of risk,
Your
right?
life's a
And
gamble.
so
Yeah.
like, so it perfectly like scratches the itch where I'm like, oh, I should really spend $5,000 on a new MacBook because it would make me build my app 30 seconds faster, and if you multiply that over the course of a year, it pays for itself. Um, those are the kinds of things where it's like where you've entered into a territory of like when have you made it? I feel like I made it when Label Live in particular is really interesting because it is kind of unbelievable. I I didn't think it would be this successful, but I had like a little hunch that if you could
Mhm.
solve a problem that people would pay for it. There's a really good book called The Mom Test that was released a year or two ago, and it's kind of focused on the tech bro culture of like, oh, I'm gonna build this cool thing. Do you think it's cool? And everyone's like, yeah, that's
Yeah,
cool. And
bro.
then they build it and it fails. And Label Live is number one, it's like incredibly unsexy. Two, it's incredibly complex. Like it is just horribly fraught with like details where if it doesn't work exactly, it's a failure, right?
Yeah,
You can't have text or a barcode falling off a label. You can't have blurry thing like there's just so many terrible parts of it and it's a dumpster fire and I've made it like a little bit less of a dumpster fire and that has earned me an income. But at the same time, there's like so much more work to do. So yes, you're right. When I saw that first sale come across, yes, that was a moment. The other moment is like people call. I was telling my wife this the other day. I said, 2 years ago, I would get an interesting lead every month. And a lead might be something like, hey, we're this really big corporation. We're looking at buying 50 licenses of your app. And I'm like, that's cool. But then they'd be silent for like 2 months as it went through like the meeting process and
yeah,
all these different things to decide. And sometimes, you never hear back from them. But now it's like I get 2 phone calls a day of like really interesting things. Like,
yeah,
hey, we want to use it like this. Hey, we're a startup and we want to like disrupt this space where we're labeling like safety equipment or other things. And I'm like, wow, okay, well, tell me about it, and we'll set up an email or a Zoom meeting or but now that the pipeline is filled with like 2 leads every day of interesting things, that means that after a few months, they're like resolving themselves, right?
yeah,
So not only do I get 2 new leads, but I'm getting like leads that are paying off and generating bursts of kind of income where I'm selling 10 or 20 licenses at a pop.
right.
Um, Something that's been really interesting is ever since I started, there's been resellers and affiliates that want to like push Label Live, and I just haven't had a way to satisfy their need to kind of push a product or a solution for their customers. And so in the next couple weeks, like I've built an entire infrastructure to support that kind of affiliate
Yeah,
and referral program,
yeah,
which I'm really excited to release and get out there. So I think that all of the leading indicators of growth are there for this particular application to succeed. I
yeah.
think, um, but I'm still like very much every day is kind of a miracle that anything works because there have been so many challenges that needed to get addressed to get it to this point.
Well, hey, so just random side note: if you listen to one of our previous episodes, or you want to, Brett Owens, a previous guest, buddy of mine, entrepreneur guy, he sold 2 affiliate marketing startups. So if you have any affiliate marketing questions, or he's
Yeah,
a wealth of knowledge in that whole area, and he's a super easy, cool guy to talk to. So anyway, and
awesome.
he's kind of like you in California. He's very very similar esque in what he built, and he does the very niche stuff, and kind of has done it all himself. It's kind of cool stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Random side note.
Yes. Because you kind of mentioned like, hey, we get these leads of people who are trying to accomplish certain things. Can you give us like a couple examples of just because when we were on the phone, you had kind of a cool example of like, hey, printing in-store labels with customized messaging on them, right, and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Can you give us a couple examples of just how end users have used their product to really push their business and make things unique and interesting?
sure, you bet. So zebra printers, label printers in general, are usually one color, black and white, and they operate on this principle of like heating up a special kind of paper, and the paper turns black. So it's just like receipt printer paper, but maybe it's on like a sticky
Sure.
label instead, right?
Yeah.
So that's like label printing. And then you have this whole idea of Avery sheets, which Josh, you were talking about, where you have like an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with like a bunch of labels going across, and you need to render multiple labels per, or maybe you want a full sheet that are all the same, but they need to be lined up perfectly.
Yeah.
And those are two distinct needs that Label Live can handle out of the box. But they're very different, but they use the same. I mean, they're different, but they're the same. It's ugly. The third thing that makes Label Live unique is that it works with color label printers. So imagine like kind of an inkjet printer, but instead of it feeding paper through, it feeds like a roll of labels on the back. And
Yeah.
so it's inkjet onto a label. So these have been popular for short run, low quantity product labels. And whether it's like farmers market jam or full color coffee, things. So instead of running 5,000 through a print shop, you're just going to print 50 on your in-house color label printer. These
Yeah.
printers cost like $1,000. So I developed a relationship with one of these popular color label printers, and they actually have facilities here in Minnesota. And they really liked what they saw with Label Live and how it enabled their customers to design and print labels very easily. So they became kind of a referral, not just on their website. When you click on their printers, it will say download Label Live, to design your labels. But they also, when they get inquiries for custom solutions, they'll forward a lot of those leads to me to kind of investigate how we could leverage Label Live. So one of them was what I would call like an experimental or experiential marketing firm that had a client that was the largest spirit distributor in the world, and they were tasked with replacing um, a glass bottle engraver, like a physical engraving machine that they would haul around to all these liquor stores to custom engrave, yeah, happy, bar mitzvah or great job. I mean, that's
Yeah,
probably
whatever.
not appropriate, but congratulations on your fourth child, kind of thing.
I think the bar mitzvah one is
Anyways,
appropriate. I think usually they get specialized spirits for the bar mitzvah. I think that's a thing.
yes. Um, so they said what we really want to do is, instead of engraving the bottles, because these bottle engravers were particularly prone to breaking down. They were, when they broke down, the people operating them were just like friendly faces that didn't really know how anything worked. They would just kind of like type into the machine and it would engrave. And so this marketing firm said, well, we want to use a color label printer with a simple application that has a form that we can select the liquor bottle. And in this case, it was a bourbon brand. And then we want to type in the text so that it will appear in the correct font with the right branding and print on these labels that would then go over the existing label, but would be color matched and look perfect. And so I set up a demo for this bourbon labeling, and they have purchased immense amount of copies to send these printers throughout the United States liquor store market to print custom bourbon label bottles on top of that the customer would then put on top of their bottle once post purchase, because of course, like, alcohol, tobacco, firearm
Yeah.
laws like
Mhm.
are very strict on like what labeling goes on there, but the customer can put whatever label they want on after they buy the bottle, so then they
Right.
bring the bottle and have this custom label printed for it.
Just
And so that's just one example.
oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
And so that's just one example of how Label Live is more of like an image processing pipeline
Yeah.
that is very easy to use. In this case, they're not integrating with Excel spreadsheet data, but they do have a few drop down menus to select the correct um, flavor of bourbon. Not flavor, but like, is it the reserve? Is it the
Right.
green, the red,
Yeah.
or the brown label kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in that case, so that's been out for about a year, with the idea that they could do a lot of different other experiential marketing for custom image labeling and printing for use by people who aren't highly technical, right? They're
Yeah.
just operators of the label printer, and they don't want to have to worry about it messing up or going off the rails. So
Mhm.
Right.
there's features that have been built into Label Live that allow you to kind of lock down certain parts of the design so that an operator can really have a simple interface to then just press a button and have it print.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Which, I mean, this is like totally random, but I mean, when you're doing something that unique, or you're not tampering with the label, but you're adding something on, do you have to go to the, did you have to get any sort of clearance from like for instance the bourbon, whichever bourbon company it was, right? To just be like, hey, your bottles are coming into the store, they're labeled this way, we're kind of modifying a little bit, right? Because I could see that as being like a, from the other user being like, hey, why are you tampering with our, spend a lot of money on that branding.
Yeah. So 1000%. Every single solution that gets made available in a store like that
Mhm.
is okayed by
Okay.
all of the marketing chain of command that goes up to the executive level, probably.
Sure.
Yeah.
They, just to give you like another idea, they are partnering. There are talks of partnership with sports teams. So all of that sports logos, team logos need to be licensed appropriately
Right.
so that there is a co-branding opportunity. Every variation of the label needs to be proofed and then submitted and okayed by those authorities or those the people at the top.
But it's
So
cool.
definitely, I
But
mean,
I see how on a big scale, like that gives the marketing and the team or whoever owns that like a lot more control over it because they're basically sitting on an almost finished product that's had its stamp of approval, and you're modifying, just the tertiary part of it, right? And
yes, just the
they get to
text.
control that. I use the word intellectual property, but they're controlling that copyrighted material. That's really cool.
Yeah, because the worst case scenario is that they print off something that looks like garbage and then it goes on Twitter,
Yeah.
Right.
right?
Yeah. So
That's the main concern is publishing things that aren't appropriate for the brand.
yeah. Well, I mean, we'll see if we can get this through, but if you and I can collaborate on maybe like a bourbon bottle that has better luck next season with the Vikings logo on it, I think there's a huge market for that.
All of Minnesota.
I'd buy them every year. uh, that's yeah. Well, that is yeah.
But
So that,
other use cases to hit on really quick, Mark,
yeah.
there's so much variation in what people are doing. One big one that's been happening. There's some drama within the label printing industry, and that is one of the very popular label printers on the market on the consumer level has introduced RFID tags in the label rolls themselves,
Mm-hmm.
preventing users from using third-party made compatible labels in this new printer. And because of that, I've fielded 20 to 30 phone calls from distraught, not customers of the printer, but people who print labels that are compatible with the printer. So they're called label converters or label manufacturers. And they say, we're doing millions of dollars a year in business on these labels, and now they're not going to be compatible with this new printer. What's the solution? And so that's been another huge part of finding a solution for this kind of self-inflicted wound in the label printing industry, with what I would consider like a very deep private equity wealth extraction
Right.
strategy that's being
Yeah.
adopted with these companies.
Yeah.
And I like to think of myself as just a small player in this big pond, but there are opportunities to help right some of those wrongs in the future.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Now,
Yeah.
with some of these applications that you chase down, because this is also another tough thing for business owners and entrepreneurs is you can get fixated on an idea, and there's a like, hey, you got to work on this until you fix the problem. But sometimes it's just a bad problem, and you're trying to fix the wrong thing. Have you run into any of those where you're like, I was working on this, and it just turns out like me giving up wasn't me giving up because I'm not ambitious enough. It was just I just needed to give up. Like that was a bad rabbit hole to go down, right? And how do you make those calls of like, yeah, this is we're gonna X this idea?
In the first episode that we recorded prior to this one, I talked a little bit about the point of sale system that I made that
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
just like had it became unmaintainable, and my excuse for quitting was just the maintenance burden. And in the technology industry, we have an entire term for this called technical debt. And technical debt is nothing but putting off the perfect solution for like a good enough solution.
Yeah.
And so the technical debt may manifest as increased time to develop the next iteration of that solution because you're kind of working with the limitations of what you've built. Or it could be that you wrote it in a way that's just like it works, but it's like backwards and upside down and inside out, and you just like you have to refactor it to make it work correctly in a way that's now you can add on to it.
Right.
Technical debt might be a lack of documentation, where you just didn't have time to write documentation, so the users don't know it's there. There's a lot of that in Label Live, because there is a feature that I might write for a specific use case that I think might be interesting, but then I just never document it because I kind of don't want people to uncover all of its like lack of features. But people do stumble across it and they're like, it would be really cool if you finished this and like made it work the right way. And it's like, yeah, I should get to that. more recently, so about a month and a half ago, our kids came home with COVID, and on the spectrum of like being COVID safe, we were like 8 out of 10 safe. We were like masking up. I had like 3M N95s. We were like, we weren't immunocompromised, like afraid of dying, but we were like, hey, let's just like, we can afford mentally and physically and financially to like do this, so let's do it. And then the kids came home from daycare with COVID. We were like, well, it's Omicron, and we're like suffering comfortably through this. And but while we were all quarantined, much like I do when it's like a rainy day, I'm like super motivated. All of a sudden I get like this hair up my butt to like work on everything. So I thought I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks like going through. I mentioned Electron as the technology that Label Live is
Mm-hmm.
based on. You have to understand that when you build software, you're like standing on the shoulders of giants. There's all these layers, and these layers are like lurching forward in versions. So there's new versions coming out all the time. And
Right.
you think like updating your Mac or your iPhone or Android is like scary. On a software, you're like, you have to upgrade each of these layers, and these layers are hugely incompatible with each other at all these different stages of their life cycle. So I just kind of stayed back with like the versions that worked for me. But in the meantime, I really need to be like 2 years ahead of I need to be like up to date with these things because other things start to fail. And then the dependency is on something in the future that I don't have. And so it becomes a very terrible game of whack a mole to get to that point. So I spent 2 weeks with Omicron, paying off that technical debt of updating all the different layers, the stack that it's built on to get Label Live modernized, in the eyes of, I mean, it's modern, but it's not like it wasn't up to date with
Right.
all of the other subsystems that were below it. So I would say like the risk of failure doing that was like really high. It was an incredibly anxious time because I felt like, well, if I can't do this, who the heck is going to do it? You know,
Mm-hmm.
like,
Right.
and if I can't do it, like Microsoft's App Store said that they won't allow any Electron apps to be published if they're not within 2 months of the latest version that's available on the internet. That's like that's a huge deal, and it's a huge barrier to publishing. So there was just, push came to shove, and it was a rainy day with COVID, and I was like pushing through it. And so I think it was like thousands of lines of code had to change in Label Live to
Yeah.
make that transition to that latest versions
Well, going
of
back
the
to that, you'll
stack.
probably, I'm not a tech guy, but I had a buddy of mine that owns a tech firm. He said when they were starting their business and they got the growth going, you kind of get to that point where you can't break the software and you only make one or, you only piss off one or two customers and they call customer support and you work them through it. You're like, when you start breaking stuff, like you get lots of phone calls and you don't have the support
Mm-hmm.
staff. So every iteration that you do has to come out like perfect, right? It can't have a whole bunch of mistakes in it. You can't be like, oh yeah, I'll fix it as they come in, or who knows what mistakes this is going to be. It has to be right, because now when people use that software, there's lots of people counting on that software to do their job. And so how
Mm-hmm.
has that changed how you develop? And obviously it changes your iteration time.
So, like I mentioned before, like label printing is such a terribly fraught with like panic and fear from the users. I mean, when it works, it fades into the background and no one cares. But when it doesn't work, it's like it's a really big deal. So Label Live, when you download it from the website and you install it on your computer, by default, it doesn't auto update itself.
Okay.
You have to be proactive as a user to update the software.
Yeah.
There's a button in the app to update, but by and large, it does not update by itself. That alone lets someone, a user, be comfortable with what they have for as long as they need it. And the
Gotcha.
licensing that I've developed is one time. By and large, it's a one time cost. So you install that license and you're good to go forever.
Yeah.
And that is kind of one of my values propositions. Like, you only have to spend the money once and you're good to go. And I feel like the market is big enough where I can justify
Yeah.
that pricing because I don't need to maximize value for shareholder value or anything like
Sure.
that. In another world, if Label Live was running in the cloud, well, what if your internet goes down? How are you going to communicate with USB devices if you have cloud software? It's not seamless. There's lag, and latency that gets introduced between the cloud and
Sure.
your software. What if you have subscription pricing that expires, and your credit card fails. Now you can't print
Right.
labels. I mean, there's all these things. Now I do offer a subscription for people that $150 is too much money, so they can pay $15 a month, and maybe they only need to print once a year, so they buy a month's worth of software and then it expires and they can just buy it again the next year. That's certainly what some people do. Um, but there is a certain, technical debt is a term that people in technology use. There's another one called like user hostile. And user hostility is where you create software with like patterns called like dark patterns that are anti-user, that end up
Yeah.
making it more difficult, or make it difficult to unsubscribe, or make it difficult to um, get a refund, all these different things. And I have just been so adamant to make sure that Label Live doesn't, has a very minimum or non-existent like dark pattern
Yeah.
in it and in its
Sure.
process. And there are places where I could make it more efficient or make it easier. But those are just my excuses. I'm a one person shop that's trying to kind of do it all. So
Yeah.
like the entire licensing system that I've built behind Label Live is all custom as well. So I'm not really beholden to any particular like licensing structure that was pre-built. Like I just decided this is how it's going to work.
Yeah.
If you have a computer that's in like a laboratory that's not connected to the internet because of national security reasons, you can download Label Live onto a flash drive, install it on that computer, get the computer registration information, bring it back to the licensing portal, buy a license, download the license, and move it back to that isolated machine without having it connected to the internet. So
Right.
I've tried to make it expert friendly in that respect too, that people can do these things without being connected to the internet. And back to your point, if I release new software, the people who complain about it are the new users that are downloading it that day,
Yeah.
which means that I don't, and it's complicated because there's like subtleties to it, but it means that sometimes I'll publish an app that's just like broken, like this last week, I had 8 days where this version I had published couldn't print to a Windows system printer. And so what did I do? I went back through all the people that signed up and I emailed them all and I said, here's a 50% off coupon. I know that you maybe found this issue. Please, like on me, like half off.
Yeah.
And there was like 10 people that took me up on that. And they were like, thank you. But that's never happened before where I've felt like so egg on my face. Like, how did I
Yeah.
introduce that bug and not find that? Like, that's just such a
Right.
ridiculous thing.
Yeah.
And there are systems that I could put in place that would automatically test the software for that kind of thing, but it would take me a week to set up. And I haven't prioritized that
Mhm.
in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Well, kind of going down another angle of like having this being applicable in business. I know just by virtue of how you and I were introduced, the spreadsheet application, how people have been able to use their label maker to then export spreadsheets to then go make business decisions. I mean, have you seen have you seen that? Because I think you mentioned in the first episode where it was like that was a very like, no, this has to be part of this. Have you seen users say, hey, based on your label makers, we're able, or how we're tracking our business now, we're able to increase revenues or do things in this way, change our business model at all? Because my brother's using your label maker to kind of reconfigure how the business he works for shows and tracks their profits. I mean, it's kind of a large project that a simple label maker's giving him the ability to do.
When I moved to the city I'm in right now, this was pre-Label Live, I went to work for this point of sale company. And part of the deal was that I would visit all 100 of their customers around the country. So I took a road trip, two different road trips. The first road trip was east of the Mississippi, went all the way out to New York, down to South Carolina, across to Texas, back up, and basically went in and said, my name's Caylan. I'm managing this business. I want to understand what you're doing. And so I'd go into these food co-ops and talk to them. And then a few months later, I did another 10,000-mile road trip west of the Mississippi and visited all these customers. And I wish that I had the time to go visit every Label Live customer, because I would learn so much of how they're saving money or it changes the way that they work. By and large, Label Live is there because they have a pain point. It needed to be solved and they're done with
Mm-hmm.
it. But I am woefully undereducated on the value that I am providing my customers. I know that they are because they write the check, and they write the check for multiple licenses, and some even will email me every year and say, "Hey, I think we're due to upgrade our support contracts," which are mostly just, I don't track them. I just give everyone support, but some people really want to see that I'm there the next year and the next year and the next year to help them with
Yeah.
any problems they have. If you compare, yeah, I'm pretty confident that my competition can do everything that I can do,
Right.
but probably with 10 times as more clicks, and it takes twice as long to set up and train someone on how to
Hmm.
use it. The nice thing about Label Live and the what's software and simple things have this phenomenon where the simplest solution is actually hiding the most complexity. So like the iPhone is so simple, right? But it's like one of the most complex devices we hold in our hands every
Yeah.
day. Label Live looks deceivingly simple, but there have been 20 to 30 really difficult problems that I had to solve that made me want to give up every time I like hit my head against it. And I was like, how am I going to solve this? Like, I don't know how to do this. This is,
Sure.
and so each one of those really technical things that I solved, like programming solutions, ends up becoming what's described as like a technical moat. So it's a moat around a castle. It's
Yeah.
a defensive
Sure.
mechanism for keeping people away. In software and tech businesses, your defensive moat is going to be something that keeps your competition away from you, right? Anyone is invited to come and try to replicate what Label Live can do, but I know that behind the scenes there are these like 20 things that need to get solved that are kind of my intellectual property and secret sauce that prevent competitors from entering that space. And I
Right.
think traditionally over the last 20 years, my competitors have felt the same way. It's very difficult to make software like this that works. And I am pretty confident that Label Live has like one of the best user interfaces to cover 85 to 90% of customer use cases for
Right.
label printing.
Yeah. That's awesome. So what is something else? Has any of your customers or clients brought something to you? Like, hey, you're really good at developing Label Live. Can you iterate and do this other thing? Has there been any of those, or you've been like, nah, I'm just going to stay with what I do. This is where I'm at.
Yeah, I've got a few of those irons in the fire right now, and they revolve around specific use cases. One, I hesitate to get into any details, but
Yeah, you don't have to give
when
detail.
I do when I do work on those kinds of things, what I always keep in the back of my mind is this will not this can't be made to just solve one problem. It's got to be
Yeah,
made to solve every problem that is similar to this one.
sure.
And so when people call and they say, why Label Live, or what is the best printer? I mentioned something maybe in the last episode about boats. What's the
Hmm.
best boat? But another way to look at it is if you go into a hardware store and ask for the best nail and hammer, that's you're not going to get an answer until you provide what are you building? What are you
Right.
trying to hammer? What is
Right.
the under what circumstances is this happening? How long does it need to last? What kind of weather is it going to be? And there's all these questions. And so with a custom person coming to me, you're a consultant doing mobile app development for 10 years like myself. You get people every week emailing you or calling you and saying, "Hey, I've got an idea for an app." And I'm like, "Great, tell me, right? Let's talk about it." And this is how the conversation goes. They tell me what they want. I tell them, have you looked in the App Store for what exists today? Yeah, it doesn't exist today. Well, have you found anything close? Yeah, there's a few things that are close. And I'm like, great, make a spreadsheet. Every row is a possible app, that exists. Each column is a feature of those apps. Create a feature matrix of where the gap is and put your fictitious new app here and tell me how it's going to check these boxes and why people would pay for it.
Yeah.
And that exercise of going through a feature matrix just with their own research, number one, it's hard. Number two, 9 times out of the 10, you figure out that there is actually something that solves your needs, or it becomes more obvious why that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And then on top of it all, like when you look at Label Live, that feature matrix for every printer that I add to the app, it can inherit all of the features that I've done for every other printer, right? Every feature that I add to the app gets to inherit all the label printers that are currently supported. So everything that I add strategically becomes multiplied by all the other work that I've done because they work together cooperatively to solve those problems.
Right.
And so a lot of times someone will request something and I'll say, that has such limited utility and it actually like prevents you from doing these other things. Like, are you sure this is the right solution? So I think saying no is actually one of the most valuable things in development of this kind of software
Sure.
because it allows you to draw a line. And without that line being drawn, you're kind of like wishy-washy. There was an article that I read about Whole Foods maybe 5, 10 years ago that said during their hiring process, everyone on the team that they were hiring a person to would have to sign off on the new hire. And it wasn't until they the team said no and rejected someone that the team really gelled and actually
Yeah.
became a team.
Right.
That if you accepted everyone, it just felt like whatever, whatever, whatever. But as soon as they found someone that like didn't really fit, then it drew a line, and now it was like, does the next person, how do they compare to that line that's drawn?
Yeah.
And so features are no different because you're going to have to maintain them going forward. They're going to break. You're going to forget about them and accidentally break them, which is called a regression in software terms. Um, there's a lot of interesting things that go along with it, and I would say that more often than not, like I'm delivering features within hours of people requesting them. So if someone's like, "Hey, can you like add a button to do this?" and I'm like, "The perfect idea. Yes, it will take me 10 seconds and then I'll run a build and send them the beta." And they're like, "Oh my God, thank you." Um,
Yeah.
but sometimes I push back and I'm like, my experience tells me that what you're requesting is going to like really burn me out, and it's just not worth it. I mean, think about
Right.
it. You have me who has like the potential to earn a certain amount of money in Silicon Valley as a software developer working for a big tech company. Instead, I've like used all of that opportunity cost to build a business that's like just now starting to maybe compete with that other reality that I could have taken. Now I'm sitting here going, okay, if I have to hire a developer, they're going to cost me $130,000 a year to get someone really good to work on this with me. Who in their right mind would have spent 5 years investing in Label Live, a startup, to finally get to a point where now we're like cash flow positive? Like that's one of the interesting things about disrupting this market is that there's no logical way to invest in my business other than me putting in the sweat equity to actually build it to a point where it's bootstrapped and can continue on, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
even now hiring someone is like, what the hell am I going to do, right?
Right.
Like, how am I going to make that equitable? So I really need to grow my revenue to a point where it becomes like for the last 3 years, I've been pretending that Label Live is bigger than it is. And now I'm actually pretending that it's smaller than it is. I'm pretending that like, no, I got this, don't worry. And I'm like, ah. So it's a
Another cup of
very like when,
Ethiopian origin.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, just like, oh, I'm so caffeinated, I can just, yeah. And I think that's a really, it's a fun problem, but it's also like, don't F this up, like, and so my wife, who's an attorney, she is very much the bureaucratic side of my like entrepreneur bubble, right? She's like, hey, you seem really excited about this, let me tell you all the ways that you're going to get screwed over, right? And she'll just be like, and so early on in the first episode that we recorded, we talked about how she was in school to get her law degree and her MBA, her master's in business. Prior to that, her 4 year degree was in entrepreneurship. She will tell you that, and she's not here to speak for herself, so please forgive me, Marcy, if I get this wrong, that the entrepreneurship program, she was a minority in it because it taught her that she didn't want to be an entrepreneur, that she was
Yeah.
more about the other side of it. And she went into insurance afterwards. So she was selling insurance and then decided to go back to school to pursue her law degree and MBA. Now she is a lawyer and she teaches at the local university business law. But when I diagnosed myself with like entrepreneurship as like one of my qualities or strengths, there it takes all kinds of people to make the world work. And I think it's very interesting how what I think is normal and what I find frustrating about lawyers, the lawyers look at entrepreneurs and think that's you're you're kind of out of your mind trying to do these things because if they could make money they would have been done before, right? Like
Right.
why
Yeah.
Mhm.
um So there's always this like push pull relationship. But luckily, like when I need contracts written, when I need contracts looked over, when I'm looking at starting something new, she can look at it with a sober view and say, okay, these are the things that we need to watch out for, and that's been incredibly helpful.
If I've noticed if there's a group of people that aren't good at reading contracts, it's usually entrepreneurs. They're like, yeah, it's great. What could possibly go wrong? Sign away. Yay. Glass is not even half full. It's like overflowing. Go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's good to have that balance,
Yes,
I'm sure.
yes, and I understand the. My wife and I have kind of a similar relationship where
Yeah.
I'm like, hey, here's my marketing idea, or here's the thing that I want to blast to my clients. Can you make it not look like it was done by a fifth grader? That'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yes. My wife is awesome, and she has talked me off the ledge of some terrible ideas. So, yeah,
Josh,
helpful.
your
It is.
automatic banana peeler, not a thing.
not a thing. Not a thing.
Uh,
Yeah.
Well,
Pro
and-
wrestling's kind of like a. Okay, go ahead.
well,
Mark.
I was gonna say, one last bit to touch on before we wrap up, because that always is. We do like getting the when the husband and wife work together, right? Because that can either be stress inducing or stress relieving, right? I mean, do you guys have a pretty good back and forth as far as like work life balance? Is that something you guys have had to like work to maintain, just to make sure it's like, hey, you're going way too far off, spending way too much time in your closet computer coding, or how's that kind of been, just from like a maintaining entrepreneurship, business life, but also finding that family time.
Obviously, my wife wants to see me succeed and be happy with that, and I think over the course of the years of our marriage, we've found that when I'm solving puzzles and helping people, that it gives me the most joy. When I'm mired in bureaucracy or conflicting requests from clients to do certain things and prioritizing, like, I'm just miserable. Managing people, like, I've had employees in the past, and they work for me for like 2-3 years, and then they go work for Apple. Like, they graduate to like Silicon Valley jobs, and I'm proud of that. But it's also like, how much work do I want to do to like be that springboard, to the.
Yeah.
Generally, yes, like, I want to provide that and I want to do that, but it takes a certain amount of energy when you're constantly doubling your workforce and halving your workforce and doubling your workforce and halving your workforce, and you're like, it what I need to do is get 4 people and lose one every year,
Right.
not
Yeah.
not lose one and gain one. That's kind of the larger picture. But back to operating with a family member, a business. My wife is not involved in the day-to-day activities. She's more of a, let's talk about this at the end of the day kind of thing, of what we each did. She has her own career path and she loves teaching, and that's like amazing, right? She's really good with students and helps them make decisions for their life. Technically, she's the attorney for the business, which works great. Um, but both of us understand that when I get a technical request that's just like way too much work, I will refer it to a larger firm. When
Yeah.
she gets a request from any of her clients, myself included, that involve things that are out of her wheelhouse, lawyers immediately know other lawyers that deal with intellectual property or contract law or real estate or things like that. So there's a certain trust that you have in that professional sphere where things get kind of like farmed out to different people. Um, we always. I know that one of the questions that you sent along for me to think about was, has there been anyone that's like really pushed you to keep going and like keep working at it? And the answer is like, no. No one thought label printing software was a good idea. Like, even the people that were like mentors, I was like, come on, let's sit down. I want to show you this. This is like what I'm thinking of. And they're like, my brother printer that I brought comes with software and yours doesn't even work as well as that one. And I'm like, yeah, but it's still early. I think this is going to be, and they're like, don't quit your day job. That was actually the number one thing that people would say to me was don't quit your day job, because they knew that I was a successful like consultant working on these big industrial clients. And now they're just kind of like a little bit in disbelief when they hear revenue numbers or how many licenses I can sell a day, and they're just like, huh, like, I would have never have guessed. But the thing is, like, this is a niche within a niche within a niche. It's like so narrowed down, but it touches a very sensitive part of every business. And what it is like I mentioned, a miniature printing press that's translating information from a computer system to like a human, or a computer system to another computer system via barcodes. I mean, these are things that exist in the physical world to get work done, and when they can't be made efficiently, everybody feels the pain.
Right.
Um, and and I don't know what the answer is. Like, for me, what kept me going wasn't the money. It was just this idea that it seemed like every month there was like more traction, and that was addictive, right? Like that gambling on like, well, should I pay another, like our ad spend at one point was like reaching $6,000 a month, and I'm like, and the conversion rates were generating like $3,000 a month in revenue. I'm like, why are we spending all this money on ads? Like this is really not reality. Like, I don't
Yeah.
know what's happening. And since then, like, we've reined in those kinds of costs, and ads are one thing I outsource. But holy moly, like, you can get so far ahead of yourself with like, whether it's like lottery tickets or scratch offs or horse racing or ad spend on Google. Like, those are all
Yeah.
part of the same category. They are
Right.
not like separate things, right? Because you're like, usually for ads, you put $1 into the machine, you want to get $2 out, or a dollar
Right.
50 or $1, right?
At least
But
it's putting our money back.
I'm putting $1 in and getting like 25 cents, and I'm like, is this how it's supposed to work? But what it comes down to is it's really difficult to strategically target ads to people that have a problem that's not really describable. Like, a
Right.
good example would be if you have a spreadsheet with 10 rows, 10 products, and you have a column that shows how many of those boxes you received, and you want to print 5 labels of row one, 7 labels of row two, 3 labels of row three, right? And you just want that column to represent how many copies you make of the labels. How do you name a feature like that? Like,
Yeah.
what do you call that? Like how do you tell Google, like, I want to print labels from a spreadsheet based on, I mean, it doesn't make sense. So I have to surface those kinds of features to people that don't even know how to ask for them.
Right.
And then you tell them, no, it can do that. And they're like, no, you don't understand. And I'm like, I do understand. I've built it. Like, I don't know what to call it, but it's like dynamic copies or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's things like that present like huge challenges, and and so that really leads me into the next little tidbit, which is, what's next for Label Live, and like, where does this go from here? And I think that's kind of like, well, good luck, Caylan. You've saturated the market, and I'm like, I don't know if I've saturated the market. Like, I'm pretty sure there's like a huge amount of people, like people who find me today. My customers are lucky. We're both lucky. They're lucky they found me, and I'm lucky to have them. And
Right.
it's everybody wins, right?
Yeah.
But there's probably 10 times more customers out there that could benefit, and there's probably features that I haven't written yet that need to be written to get them in there.
Mm-hmm.
So the big thing that I'm pushing on is going to be looking into printer models to bring into the United States that satisfy a lot of needs of my customers that aren't really represented by label printers that exist today. So, like, this is an example of one here. It opens up like this, and the labels go in. Super boring, but this is a unique model in that it does things that like many of the other label printers on the market don't do, and it can do them well. And since I can vertically integrate the software with the hardware, there's kind of an opportunity to kind of bring a more vertical solution to the market.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Oh,
Cool.
well, that was another super full episode. That is
That was
awesome.
great stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And again, listeners, we're going to have social media channels and everything in the show notes. So if you want to learn more, or even like go look at his product, look at his, look at Label Live, and how it could be, applicable to your business, please check the show notes and do that. So with that, we'll head into the speed round and
Just
and wrap up.
one last quick comment on the entrepreneur part of it is, we were talking about following your passion, and you did something that's so niche, right? But it really, sometimes niche is the best place to be, because again, it creates those moats. But two, you're solving a problem that kind of a lot of people have, right? It's a niche problem that's wide. I don't know if there's a good way to explain that. What's that? The niche wide problem solver, which is really cool, because it's something. I mean, look, if you look, I was like randomly looking around my desk and looking at everything that has labels on it, and you're like, oh yeah, we use labels for everything, like literally everything we touch.
A lot of the decision making charts are based on like two axes, right? So you have
Yeah.
like you have like wide and you have deep, right?
Yeah.
And so you have these things where it's like the need for label printing is wide and the solution needs to be deep enough in features to actually like get it done. I talked
Yeah.
a little bit about like feature
Mhm.
matrices like apps and
Yeah.
features, or even in Label Live, it's like supported printers and features, and how when you multiply them together, you get this like more than two dimensions, right? Of like
Right.
what it is. And so when you talk about like why is Label Live successful, and I think it's because we're conditioned to look at things on those two scales, on those two axes,
Yeah.
but there's more, right?
Sure.
It touches on a different axes where it's like it's wide and deep, and then it's like ubiquitous or it's like hidden. There's some level
Sure.
of
Yeah.
like label printer shame, I think, is what it amounts to. It's like, I mean, it's. I'll just go back to the colonoscopy joke. It's like it's ubiquitous, everybody needs it, and yet it's like no one talks about it, and the people who specialize in it make great money, but like
Yeah. It's not
no one's
not
clamoring to be them when
sexy.
they grow up.
Yeah. Absolutely. Cool. Well, awesome. I think, like you said, Mark, let's kick off the speed round.
All right. So first speed round question. We're assuming you're on Shark Tank. We're assuming you got deals from every shark, right? Which shark are you most excited to bring on board, and why?
So I love this question. And the reason I love it is because I have no idea really what Shark Tank is. I have listened to the How I Built This podcast with Mark Cuban, and that's probably like the most, or when they mention Shark Tank on How I Built This podcast, I'm like, oh yeah, that's pretty interesting. But it is so, the reason that I don't watch it is one is like I don't have network TV and it doesn't stream, I don't think, so
Yeah.
I'm not privy to it. But if you remember back, there's a show, I think it was HBO, had like Silicon Valley, and it was
Classic.
right. I could not watch that when it was released in like 2012, 2013. It hit so close to home that I was like, I can't do it. Like it's just so brutally like making fun of me, and like I have this history of being made fun of, so it's like it was like I was allergic to it.
Yeah.
Then like 3 years ago, I like watched the first episode, and I'm like, hey, the that sting has worn off, and now it's
Yeah.
just hilarious. And
It's
I binged the whole thing, and I was like, I'm glad I watched it. Shark Tank is probably very similar, where it's like I it just makes me cringe, and I just can't. I don't have time for it. A lot
yeah.
of my hobbies I have to do while I'm doing something else that's like not important. So like I don't read books unless I'm in the bathtub, and I don't take a bath unless I'm reading a book, right? Like I have to do them together because separate they're like way too boring by themselves.
Yeah.
Um, so Shark Tank, I don't know. I have been told that it's fun to have conversations with me about this like once, and then they're like,
Yeah.
oh, we can't have like no more talking about label printers
Wah,
at dinner.
wah.
It's like we're done. Um, so I would have only one chance on Shark Tank, and I don't think anyone would invest in it. But if they saw the revenue numbers, they might be intrigued and then wonder why no one else had done it.
Yeah.
But that's it. I mean, there's
Well, well. On that note, I hope I never catch you reading.
Yeah.
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 What's that
Yeah.
like the old Bill Hicks joke? Like, what you reading for?
Yeah.
Not what are you reading, but what are you reading for? Anyways,
All right. So if you're needing some serious unwind time, what are you doing and where are you going to blow off some steam?
we live in Winona, Minnesota. Right, it's like an island almost on the Mississippi River, and we have a few different boats that we'll go out on the river with in the summer. And
Oh,
so it's
nice.
been like a huge source of inspiration. So we picked up a 1969 houseboat last spring and have been fixing it all up. And so we take the kids out on that just about every weekend in the summer,
I
and
like it.
then just float on it during the week. And then during the winter, you know, I have been suffering comfortably inside. I usually it's cross country skiing or road cycling, outdoor activity.
Yeah.
But at this point, I just get enough joy from being around the kids right now
Yeah.
to really not want to go outside and get sweaty underneath clothing, mountain biking on
Yeah.
snow. Yeah.
Well,
All right, Mark, take it home.
last one is if you could adopt any superhero powers, which powers are you absorbing?
I have a friend who had gifted me, who's really heady, right? And so we like talk about time and how it works. And he said, "Hey, I'm gonna send you this book." So he bought me a one of my first comic books which is like an X-Men called House of X, which maybe like one of your listeners is familiar with. But reading this book, it talks about it's kind of an analog to time and like Buddhist feelings on like quantum time theory and like all these different things mixed together. And there's, all the different X-Men with their mutant superpowers, and one of them has the ability to like live, die, and like be reincarnated, but remember all of their life, from past lives, and how it just always ends in like the mutants being destroyed. But then there's another character that's a mutant that can see into the future. So you have one mutant that can see into the past and one that can see into the future, and they try to like disrupt each other's activities. And it's just like such an interesting thing. So if I were a superhero, it would probably be something to do with like time and better understanding like how we live in this immediate zone of like not too big like the cosmos and not too small like the atoms, but like we exist in this space that's just like uniquely humanly weird to live in, where a second is a second and a minute's a minute.
Strange. You're Doctor Strange.
Yeah, there you go.
Is Doctor Strange? Is that a Marvel comic or is that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought it was like Aqua Teen Hunger Force or something.
My friends and I we used to try and think about, when we had nothing else to do. We're like, all the mutants have like useful powers. What if there was like, you had a mutation where it wasn't really useful? And one of ours that we developed was you could freeze time, but only when your eyes are crossed, so you really can't see what's going on. Like, hey guys, I can freeze time, but I don't know what's happening. So
yeah, it's funny because so many of those things, it's like with anything in life, if you can explain it, if you can teach it, you've kind of mastered it. Like enough to like know the subtleties of how to make someone else think what you're thinking. But with like a lot of this time stuff, you like explain it and it doesn't sound right, and you're like, I don't know what I'm talking about. Like I don't know what any of this stuff even means. Like how does it? Brings me back to my childhood all over again. But thank you guys. I really appreciate coming on here.
Yeah, this was awesome. I mean,
thank you so much, Caylan.
Yeah, this was super fun. And again, I'm sure we could do many episodes. Maybe when we go back and find a couple other guests that we had lots to talk about and do third or fourth episodes. But anyway, very fun. Thank you for being on. We had a blast. Everyone, check out the show notes again. And you can find links to go follow Caylan and his entrepreneurial adventures and check out Label Live.
And Caylan, how can people get a hold of you if they wanted to, besides going to Label Live?
The easiest way is, Label Live for sure. Any of the contact forms you fill out on that website, go to me directly. Otherwise, my business name is Semireg Industries, so semireg.com, and I also have a contact form and email address on that page. I'm not too active on Twitter, and I guess you could find me on LinkedIn as well.
I figured you'd be a big Instagram guy. That's kind of where I was, big.
I shut down my
TikTok.
Instagram.
He looks like a TikTok guy.
TikTok, yeah.
Back when Facebook bought Instagram and changed their terms of service, I bounced off there and moved everything to Flickr, which then got bought by SmugMug, which then was abandoned. So I don't really have like all of our photos now of kids we share on Apple Photos, sharing with family. So it's a
that sounds familiar.
It's a quiet existence in the backwoods,
Right.
Yeah. That describes Minnesota very very accurately. So
there you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And again, nothing we say can or should be taken as tax, legal, or financial advice. Thank you so much for listening. If anything did sound interesting, go seek professional legal counsel prior to doing so. Caylan, thank you so much for being on. Really looking forward to getting this out to our listeners.
You're welcome. Have a good day. We'll see you.